Atheism, the belief there is no God. The purpose of this video is simple, that atheism will be best understood as the philosophical understanding, belief there is no God. Asserting that it's just a lack of belief in a God just pushes the goalpost down that will still lead to the most optimal definition being the belief there is no God. I plan on examining aspects such as the history of the word, the logical understanding it, and even some common objections. I don't expect most viewers to change their minds, but I'll put my reasonings out there. The earliest mention of any word remotely similar to the words of atheist and atheism was the Greek word Atheos. While the word Theos is attributed to God, the A implies an absence of. So, an absence of God. Now, some individuals may look at the meaning and say, look, it says absence of gods. You answer your own question. This is a waste of a video. Well, hold on there. When looking at this word, it was commonly referred to as meaning godless, God-forsaken, contrary to God's law, or without gods. But just because it has a meaning without gods doesn't mean everything without God is an atheist. I mean, I wouldn't call a rock an atheist. I'm not calling a banana an atheist, even though both are without God. The reason there are multiple English meanings were to convey what the word atheos meant during the time period. For example, Tom might define water as clear liquid, Matt might define water as H2O, Phil might define water as stuff that falls from the sky. Now, none of them are wrong, as they're using different definitions to describe the meaning of what the word implies. All these English translations of the word atheos in different sources were meant to describe the same, or at least a similar concept. Atheos was ascribed to those who lost the favor of the gods. They were considered God-forsaken, ungodly, godless, etc. However, there seems to be a shift into a second meaning. Quoted from Tim Washman, Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World, within the lifetime of the classical Athean democracy. However, it came to acquire a second meaning, referring to someone whose beliefs or practices suggest a lack of commitment to belief in the gods. One who lost the favor of the gods, God-forsaken. Not someone who just lacks the belief there is a God. Not some default position where everyone is born into it. One had to actively choose to fall into that descriptive label. Now, as time passed on, you will eventually have groups like Christians being called atheists by the Romans. Not necessarily just because they only lacked the belief in the Roman pantheon, but because they actively denied it to serve the one true God. Now, this isn't to say one should look at the origin of the word to determine its meaning, but to show the early understanding of the word and to show its origins and how some people might use it as an active action instead of a default position. The word atheist could easily be defined as it appeared early on in 1571. Stated by the Oxford English Dictionary, one who denies or disbelieves the existence of a God, while an alternative definition may be stated as one who practically denies the existence of a God by disregard of one's moral obligation in that respect, a godless person. Now, these definitions came before the earliest definitions of the English edition of atheism, and even before the words of theist and theism. I mean, surprising, isn't it? Now, this isn't to say that the claim that an atheist makes came before the claim a theist makes, but just that there was a definition and usage of the word atheist that came before the idea that atheism is just being defined as lacking or not theist. I mean, how can we have it that way if there was no word theist? And we'll discuss how to break the words down in another section though. Now, there is no doubt by just searching for the definition of atheism or atheist in Google, you may get different descriptive meanings. I mean, Oxford Languages define it as disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. Merriam-Webster lists two definitions: a lack of belief or a strong disbelief in the existence of God or gods, and a philosophical or religious position characterized by disbelief in the existence of gods or gods. Britannica states, atheism, in general, is a critique and denial of the metaphysical beliefs in God or spiritual beings. Cambridge Dictionary is a fact of not believing any God or gods, or the belief that no God or gods exist. Now, funny thing is that most of these definitions represent atheism in some regard to the strong atheism, and that the or in the dictionary was just a way to show both phrases describe an atheist. But a key thing to know is that these definitions do describe atheism. These definitions are not prescriptive when determining the definition of one who subscribes to atheism. For example, back to our water definition. Phil's definition of water as a descriptive definition is stuff that falls from the sky. I mean, it's not wrong. It's very vague though, but it's not wrong. But that doesn't mean we should prescribe stuff that falls from the sky as water. Lacking the belief there is no God describes theism. Okay, I don't believe any God exists. And you consider me a theist? I'm glad we got you on record. Straw man. That is not what I said. This is literally the discussion of whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not. It's an argument of labeling or prescribing labels. The main reason one would say a hot dog is a sandwich is because they are prescribing the label of a sandwich based on a descriptive definition of a sandwich. If you want to label a hot dog a sandwich, it's your God-given right. However, you must remember that the English language is largely descriptive. If one wants to categorize things or take a prescriptive approach based on a descriptive definition, anyone can focus and choose a specific descriptive definition to create labels or categories. Remember, dictionaries may use different descriptive definitions to describe the same thing. For example, I may prescribe the label of a sandwich to a hot dog based on a descriptive definition of any food item that consists of a filling between two pieces of bread, while someone else may not prescribe the label of a sandwich to a hot dog based on a descriptive definition of a food item that has a filling between two flat pieces of bread. They categorize it indifferently based on which descriptive definitions they want to focus on. So, these definitions describe what atheism is, as Oxford Languages define it as disbelief or a lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. But this doesn't mean that we should prescribe people who have the lack of belief in the existence of gods or gods as atheists. But going back to the definition and usage of the word, some may question the usage or meaning of the word disbelief. Now, disbelief can be looked upon as two ways depending on the context. One is believe not, which is like an active form of the negation, while not believe is simply a lack of the belief in the affirmation. Disbelief seems to encompass both. Now, although there may be seemingly different definitions to describe that word, which some commenters might be saying, look, that word has different definitions, so why can't atheism? Well, while I believe that words have meanings and definitions can be used to describe them, this part of the video is just discussing what seems to be the most historical accurate portrayal of the word atheist or atheism was, with the future sections describing the meaning of how some individuals may define atheism as one way, with me showing what I claim it best to be. Anyway, disbelief can be agreed upon for this discussion to be viewed upon as an active form of believing not, as the OED has defined it as the action or an act of disbelieving, mental rejection of a statement or assertion, or positive unbelief, believe not. Now, other examples will include disbelieving being used by others to describe atheists are the atheists would say there is no God, that thou atheist, that thou deny his power which did create thee. To believe nothing of a designing principle or mind, nor any cause or measure or rule of things, but chance, is to be the perfect atheist. By the atheist, I understand that man who not only holds off like the skeptic from the affirmative, but who drives himself or is driven to the negative assertion in regards to the whole unseen or to the existence of God. And even the American Atheist Organization understood that this disbelief is an assertion saying, to be clear, atheism is not a disbelief in the gods or denial of gods, it is a lack of belief in gods. Following these examples of atheism, one can see that the historical definitions were conceptualized before the words of theist and theism, as one who denies and disbelieves the existence of a god, or in other words, one who believes there is no God. This isn't to say that we should follow how these individuals use their terminology of the word atheist to define it, but just that the understanding and common knowledge of that word meant one who denies there is a God, and that the definition of lacking the belief there is a God will lead to serious communication problems, which I will explain later on. Now, when determining the meaning of a word, one could easily just investigate the dictionary for a definition to get two seemingly different answers. While each dictionary may describe a word differently, the meaning what word implies stays the same. For example, look at all these examples of how certain dictionaries define water. Merriam-Webster states that one of the definitions of water as it descends from the clouds as rains is a major conduit for all living matter, very slight compressible liquid oxide, hydrogen H2O, freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, boils at 100 degrees Celsius, has a high percentage of hydrogen and hydroxide ionized, is a poor conductor of electricity and a good solvent. While Wikipedia just describes it as an inorganic compound with the chemical formula of H2O. They have vastly different definitions, but still describe the same thing. Now, while I would like to just point to the definition of the word atheist and the use of the examples I provided earlier, some individuals will point to that words' meanings and uses change throughout time. And while I agree that words may change definition, again, this section is just showing what the word's intent was, how it was used, shows it's still a valid meaning for how some atheists do define themselves. Now, this is just describing how atheists, or atheism in general, has a claim, the belief there is no God, just based on the definitions provided. Again, it's not saying we should subscribe to those definitions of the word atheism, but just show off what the word seems to mean. Now, I would love to use these as the reasons to understand the definition of atheism, but the most common response I hear when I bring this up is, definitions of words change throughout time. There is no dictator of the English language, which is not incorrect, as I stated earlier that the English language is descriptive. But I do find it funny when I try to explain the definition of atheist and atheism, I met with opposition who claims that definitions change. When I try to provide an alternative to the definition of theism to mean lack of belief there is no gods, I'm pointing that the definition doesn't mean that. I mean, all you need is one guy to start a trend, right? The first instance that seems to suggest that atheism has a neutral default position came from Baron D. Holbach, with his quote, "All children are born atheists. They have no idea of God." It seems his primary purpose of his 1772 work, Good Sense Without God, was to show that people can be moral and rational without believing in God, and that atheism should be seen as the default position. Now, prior to De Holbach's influence, there seems to be little evidence to suggest that atheism was commonly understood as just a lack of belief in a God, as opposed to an active denial of God's existence. This isn't to say that individuals didn't harbor such beliefs, but the earliest documented advocacy of this perspective appears to originate with De Holbach. The next piece of work that appears to continue this trend of redefining atheism as a lack of belief appears to be in the mid-19th century by Charles Bradlaugh. In 1864, he penned a work titled A Plea for Atheism. This publication is often cited as a turning point in the understanding of atheism. Bradlaugh's definition of atheism tried to diverge from the traditional understanding of the term to new terminology. The atheist does not say there is no God, but he says, "I know not what you mean by God. I am without idea of God. The word God is to me a sound conveying no clear or distinct affirmation. I do not deny God, because I cannot deny that of which I have no conception, and the conception of which by its affirmer is so imperfect that he is unable to define it to me. However, God is defined to mean an existence other than the existence of which I am a mode, then I deny God, and affirm that it is impossible such God can be true." Bradlaugh's A Plea for Atheism was a bold attempt to challenge prevailing prejudices against atheism, dispel misconceptions, and uphold to him what seems like the moral integrity of atheism. If one were to interpret atheism as merely the lack of belief in God, then every newborn would be classified as an atheist, as they are yet to form any belief about God. You have instances like Anthony Fleur's The Presumption of Atheism, and even Stephen Bullock's section in the Oxford Handbook of Atheism that pushes for, or recommends, that atheism should be seen as something along the lines of an absence or lack of belief there are gods. There's no doubt that there will also be individuals who will always discuss this, but this section is just showing that it seems to be a relatively recent idea to that atheism being defined as just a lack of belief there is a God. It seems to come very recently in history. Now, in my opinion, it's akin to redefining water traditionally known as H2O to include a separate definition as just hydrogen. To the best of my knowledge, there are no historical documents prior to Baron de Holbach's work that suggest atheism was intended to mean lack of belief in God or any similar phrasing. While this doesn't exclude the possibility that this term was used in this matter, there seems to be a lack of evidence supporting the interpretation of atheism in my eyes. While some individuals may support this modern interpretation of atheism and acknowledge its relatively recent emergence, I will try to later discuss the issues where I see this definition, as it fails to adequately distinguish between different perspectives on the existence of God. Now we have to look at the term agnosticism. There seems to be different perspectives on it. The term was first coined by T.H. Huxley in about 1869. He found himself in a dilemma, unable to align with the existing labels of atheist, theist, pantheist, materialist, idealist, or just Christian. He felt that none of those terms accurately represented his philosophical position. In The Great Agnostic by R.H. Hutton, published in The Spectator in 1895, he stated, "Professor Huxley, as he often and eagerly proclaimed, was no materialist or atheist. The guy who coined the term agnostic about 160 years ago didn't want to be called an atheist, as agnostic was the name demanded by Professor Huxley for those who disclaimed atheism." Huxley observed that many people claim to have attained a certain gnosis or knowledge about the existence or nature of God. During an early meeting in the Metaphysical Society, each member identified their religious or political position. Finding himself without a label, Huxley coined the term agnostic to describe his position. Huxley's agnosticism was a philosophical position that one cannot know the existence of anything beyond the phenomena of experience. This term was quickly adopted by others who found themselves in a similar philosophical predicament. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Atheism, agnosticism is defined as a theory, belief, or ideology entailing the belief that nothing is known or can be known of immaterial things with the particular reference to the existence or nature of God. According to the OED, an agnostic will be a person who believes that nothing is known or can be known of immaterial things, expressly of the existence or nature of God, distinguished from atheism. Again, these definitions describe an agnostic position, the lack of belief that there is a God and the lack of belief there is no God. Now, over my conversations, some individuals prefer to use terms like agnostic, agnostic, atheist, or theist. I mean, you have a free mind, you can do whatever you want. The reasons I don't use these terms in the videos is that they are very ill-defined terms in my eyes. I mean, everyone uses them differently, with some saying things like agnostic, atheist, or theist can't exist. I mean, you can just type in for a chart in Google and everyone will show you their own personal, unofficial chart of what they believe the terms are. Originally, the Gnostics were and currently are a group of individuals that believe to have some type of special divine knowledge. I don't know what to call it set to Christianity, but I mean, they have their own distinguished beliefs. It's a whole different thing. Now, some individuals may define those terms, again, are really vague, which is why I don't use them. I mean, here are 3 examples of how some individuals define those terms. Agnostic theist is I know that a God exists. Agnostic theist is I believe that a God exists. Agnostic atheist, I don't believe a God exists. And Gnostic atheist is the same as an anti-theist. I know that God doesn't exist. Then again, what if someone believes God doesn't exist? Here's another. Agnostic atheist does not conform either yes or no on the question of God's existence and lacks belief that there is a God. Gnostic atheist claims to have the knowledge that a God does not exist and also, of course, lacks the belief in one. Agnostic theist does not conform either yes or no on the question of God's existence but believes in a God. And Gnostic theist claims to have the knowledge that God exists and of course believes there is a God. Then again, for this one, what if someone believes God doesn't exist? Is that some type of category we're skipping? And lastly, you have this. That is someone who says, I believe there is a God or gods, but I don't know. Agnostic atheist, I don't believe there is a God or gods, but I don't know. Gnostic theist is a liar and a grifter. And Gnostic atheist doesn't exist because they would have to be a god to know there is no God, therefore making their beliefs false. Apparently, the theist is a liar and grifter, but atheism, that's crazy. As you can see, there are really ill-defined terms. I mean, I try to find studies about this, and it seems why some may use terms like an agnostic atheist or such. None of them really defines or explains the difference in using these terms. I mean, from the way I'm looking at it, technically everyone who is an atheist or theist will be an agnostic, as knowledge is a subset of belief. Everything you know, you believe. Everything you claim to know, you are claiming to believe. But I try to stay from those topics because there's no consensus or understanding of those terms, but we can skip the agnostic and gnostic for now. It seems that some individuals want to associate the term atheism and atheist to non-theism and non-theist. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Atheism, non-theism is referred to in common usage to indicate the absence of theism, as distinct from the explicit rejection of theism. They also identify non-theism in new scholarship as any phenomena primary contrast to theism. Simply, according to the OED, a non-theist is basically a person who is not a theist. It seems that this term easily encompasses agnostic and atheist instead of saying the term atheist should encompass just a pure agnostic and atheist, a view that some may hold. And lastly, to talk about certain terms, some individuals want to push as the new strong atheism is an anti-theist. I mean, one common pushback to stating that the belief there is no God shouldn't be used as to define atheism is that definition should subscribe to anti-theist. That should be farther from the truth. Anti means against or opposite. An anti-theist will be one who is against or opposed to theism. Typically, an anti-theist may be against theism or religion in general. There is a difference between one who is opposed to believe there is a God and one who believes there is no God. Now in this section, I will now try to stay on this path of describing the word atheism without using full dictionary definitions, but by just breaking down the word into the parts that made it. Let's start with the main word of them all, Theos. The most common understanding of Theos is God, but this word isn't limited to it, as it can mean deities, supernatural being, gods, the creator, etc. But we'll probably stick to God to keep it simple for now. Now, once you add the ism, this denotes terms for philosophies, theories, ideologies, and in this case belief, as is defined as a word-forming element making nouns implying a practice, system, doctrine, etc. So Theosism would translate to theism, being the belief there is a God, doctrine there is a God, etc. The Greek letter A is commonly used to indicate negation or absence of. For example, apathy is a lack of interest, amoral is lacking moral principles, asexual is lacking sexual desire, and so on. Now, the Greek word Atheos was already established as it means without God, denying the gods, or even godless. This word already had the A added to the Theos. This word already was attributed to individuals like Diagoras of Milos, and Diodorus the Atheist. This guy and that guy, but for now, let's ignore this. The issue comes with the ism. Some individuals see the word atheism as atheism or not theism, or lack of belief there is a God, and not see it as atheosism or belief that there is no God. While we already explained the Greek word atheos in a previous section, in my personal experiences, even if some individuals want to define atheism as a lack of belief in a God, they are not being consistent with asking them how to define other similar structured words. Let's start with theist. While keeping the word theos in theist to mean God, and others as explained earlier, the is would denote terms for a person as is defined as a word-forming element meaning one who does or makes, also used to indicate adherence to a certain doctrine or custom. So theos is would indicate theist to mean one who believes there is a God. As you can see, the is denotes the theist as someone. If one were to imply the same idea that atheism is atheism or not theism, one would have to be consistent when defining atheist as atheist or not or lack of one who believes there is a God. Now that might sound okay, but based on this definition, my car is an atheist, my cup is an atheist, the rocks are atheists, even the birds in the sky are atheists. Some might think that's a joke, but one must understand that the is already denotes someone. Atheist should be understood as one who believes there is no God. Or how about the word agnosticism? This word is defined as a doctrine, tenets, view, belief, philosophy, etc. just based on the ism at the end. If we define the word as similar to atheism, agnosticism will be defined as a lack or not doctrines of such and such. Agnosticism is a doctrine. Atheist is a person. The ism and the is denotes these things already. A person or a doctrine. One would be consistent with the word atheism and define it as a doctrine, belief, philosophy, or etc. Now, there are some individuals that believe that rocks can be atheists, or more specifically, prescribing them as implicit atheists. While I believe is a more consistent position if one wants to define atheism as not theism and call a rock an atheist since it's a not theist, over those who want to use a similar definition of atheism but not prescribe the label of atheist to inanimate objects. I will explain why that view on atheism is still flawed, as one can still prescribe the label of theist to a rock based on the same criteria, but I'll explain that later in the video. Even after explaining the history of the word, the definition of the word, and even breaking down the word, some individuals may disregard those reasons and state that atheism still just means lacking the belief in the existence of gods. So be it. One doesn't even need to look at the previous reasons for understanding the problem. Some individuals want to define atheism as only that way, or more specifically, dividing atheism into two different types of atheism. All you need to do is look into it logically. I believe there is a unicorn. I believe there is no unicorn. I don't believe neither there is a unicorn or no unicorn. Unicornist, a unicornist, agnostic. I believe there is a unicorn. I'm just saying that believing in unicorns is rational, illogical, or both. It isn't a belief that's supported by any objective empirical evidence. I don't believe neither. Do you believe there is no unicorn? I guess I'm being ignored. I don't even know what a unicorn is supposed to be. You already said believing in unicorns is irrational and such. You already know it's the concept. What about yours specifically? What do your unicorns do and how and why do they do it? That's not the question. Do you believe there is no unicorns? I did answer the question. I have knowledge that unicorns cannot be objectively real. Belief was left behind decades ago. Can you tell me anything substantious about your unicorns? That's irrelevant. I know you don't believe there are unicorns. I'm asking you, do you believe that there are no unicorns? What about C? Oh, he's also a unicornist. He's with me. I can say the same thing. Now, most individuals who criticize the idea that atheism shouldn't mean best the belief in no gods aren't familiar with the semiotic square of opposition. Heck, even I wasn't when I made the video, but apparently I used it when explaining how I saw the flaw with the idea that atheism just means the lack of belief in gods. This square is a logical diagram that represents relationships between categorical propositions in traditional logic. This square will be used to prove my claim. Now, Stephen Henry McCrae created an excellent paper one may want to read that goes into a lot more depth in this about the square in regards to atheism and theism, and I'm going to try to use how he describes these terms in it. I also need to point out that after I finished this part of the script, I had used my previous videos when discussing the square. Then I found his paper, How the Presumption of Atheism by the Way of a Semiotic Square of Opposition Leads to the Semiotic Collapse. To further explain future parts, I then added some parts like special pleading section, which I also found he talks about in his blog after I wrote it. Just letting you know that this was not some one-to-one copy, but this happened to have similar conclusions. Theism may be easily defined as belief in the existence of a god or gods. Now, as I explained in a previous video, I usually use the definition belief that there is a god to convey this point, as it's much shorter to convey. I will use the word God even though theism may involve gods with an S or maybe just labeled as deities. It'll be simpler to just use the word God. But let's not use the word theism or atheism for now. Let's just break down the positions. In the formula, we will have G, which will represent at least one god exists. Not G will represent the negation of G, that no God exists. B will represent belief, while S will represent the subject or individual. So for example, BSG will be the belief that the proposition G is true, or in other words, the belief that at least one God exists. Another way is the subject believes that G is true. Now, since we have that one, we would need to create the other three and place them adequately in the square. Since B represents belief, we'll place it in the top left. Next to BSG, we will have the formula being BS not G, or in other words, the belief that the proposition G is false, or again, in other words, the belief that no God exists. Next, we need to establish not B. For this discussion, we will call it non-belief. If one wants to, they can allow that non-belief to mean lack of belief, or more specifically, not belief. So, not BSG will be the non-belief that the proposition G is true, or in other words, the lack of belief that at least one God exists. We'll place that towards the right of the square under B, S, not G, as a result of each one having quote-unquote one negative. And for future reasons, we will explain that later. Lastly, we'll have not B, S, not G, and that will be the non-belief that the proposition G is false, or in other words, the lack of belief that no God exists. Before we continue, if one wants to say that the negatives cancel each other out in not B, S, not G, while I don't agree, one would have to be consistent to say not BSG and BS not G means the same thing if they are consistent with their logic. Just food for thought. Now looking at the square, there are multiple connections that need to be addressed. BSG and BS not G are both contrary beliefs. Both statements cannot be true at the same time. For example, every human is a man and no human is a man cannot be both true. BSG is a sub-alternation to not BS not G, meaning the first implies the truth of the second. For example, every person who believes there is a God will lack the belief there is no God or have the non-belief that there is no God. But not everyone who has the non-belief that there is no God will believe that there is a God. This sub-alternation will work similarly to BS not G to not BSG. Next, BSG and not BSG are both contradictions. The truthful one automatically falsifies the other. For example, one cannot lack the belief there is a God and believe that there is a God. Lastly, not BSG and not BS not G will be sub-contrary. This is similar to how contrary beliefs as both can't be true. Sub-contrary propositions work the opposite way, as both propositions can both be true but can't both be false. So one can both lack the belief that there is a God and lack the belief there is no God. Now outside the square, we distinguish the beliefs already for the top two. Now for the bottom two, we will give the distinction as non-beliefs. For the size of the square, we will wait for that for now. Based on the square, there will only be three possibilities or categories in the sense where an individual might lie. Let's look at each proposition. If one says they believe that there is a God, they will automatically reject the lack of belief that there is a God, since they are contradictions. The individuals cannot logically say they also believe that there is no God, since both are contrary and cannot both be true. Lastly, they will already imply that they lack the belief that there is no God, since saying they believe that there is a God is a subalternation, and since they do not believe that there is no God, they already imply to think lacking the belief there is no God. This type of reasoning can be applied the same way as one saying they believe that there is no God. They cannot logically also believe that there is a God, are implied to lack the belief that there is a God, and cannot lack the belief that there is no God. Now let's try a different approach. What if one states they lack the belief that there is a God, or have the non-belief that there is a God? They would not believe there is a God, as both are contradictions. Now, there are two options left. Do they have the non-belief that there is no God also, or do they believe that there is no God? One would have to ask the question, do you believe that there is no God? If they answer yes, you should know the rest. If they state they lack the belief there is no God, that would be an acceptable response, since both answers are sub-contrary. This type of reasoning can be applied the same way as saying the lack of belief there is no God, or the non-belief there is no God. Now this leads to three categories. An individual that believes that there is a God, who also has the non-belief that there is no God. An individual that believes there is no God, who also has the non-belief that there is a God. And an individual that has the non-belief that there is a God, and the non-belief that there is no God. Now what do we call these terms? Let's go back to the square. Everything to the right of the square is commonly referred to as atheism, with the lack of belief or non-belief being commonly known as weak, negative, or soft atheism. The belief there is no God will be referred to as a strong, positive, hard atheism. On the opposite side of the square, we must apply the same logic. The left of the square will be referred to as theism, with the lack of belief referred to as weak, negative, soft theism. The belief that there is a God will be referred to as strong, positive, or hard theism. If one side wants to claim that atheism has a weak and strong distinction, both sides need to have a weak and strong distinction. Atheist Australian philosopher Graham Opie said it best. In particular, it seems to me to be a mistake to use a distinction between strong atheism and weak atheism to subsume agnosticism under atheism. Strong atheists reject the claim that there are gods, while weak atheists refrain from accepting the claim that there are gods. For if we accept that there is a distinction between strong atheism and weak atheism, we should surely accept that there is a similar distinction between strong theism and weak theism. Strong theists reject the claim that there are no gods, while weak theists merely refrain from accepting the claim that there are no gods. And then we shall have it that agnostics are both weak atheists and weak theists. If one wants to differentiate between strong and weak atheism, they must refer the same rights to strong and weak theism. And this brings us back to the flaw with calling rocks atheists. Because if one wants to prescribe the label of atheist to a rock because they lack the belief there is a God, if they are consistent, that rock could also be a theist since it lacks the belief there is no God. So if we're playing those games, a rock is both a theist and an atheist. But it's wild in my eyes to prescribe rocks that way. But anyway, now when placed them into the chart, it leads to three categories. The individual that believes there is a God, who also lacks the belief there is no God, will be a strong theist and weak theist. The individual that believes there is no God, who also lacks the belief there is a God, will be a strong atheist and weak atheist. And the individual that lacks the belief there is a God and lacks the belief there is no God will be a weak theist and a weak atheist. Now we keep it simple. The first individual will just be a strong theist. The second individual will be just a strong atheist. And the third individual will be both a weak theist and a weak atheist. Again, just to break it down and keep it simpler, the first individual will just be a theist, one who believes there is a God. The second individual will be an atheist, one who believes there is no God. And the third individual will be just agnostic. Both atheism and theism will lose the strong, as there is no weak atheism or theism. It'll be pointless to call them strong atheists or theists at that point. Now, a common response I get when to calling this third group just agnostic is that we should still somehow call them just atheists still. Now, an individual may still define atheism as the lack of belief that there is a God. And if one wants to take that approach, one could also define theism as a lack of belief that there is no God. And if one wants to deny that theism can be defined in such a way, having both a weak and strong theism, but atheism somehow can be defined in a way having a weak and strong atheism, then that individual will be guilty of special pleading. they'll be applying a different standard to atheism without applying the same standard to theism. A lack of belief there is no God applies to a theist or theism in general. That third category will include both lacking claims of a strong theist and a strong atheist. Even after explaining the logic of using the word, along with everything else, there will always be objections. These are some of the most common objections I hear in the comment section. Some individuals might argue that saying there is no God should not be seen as an equally valid claim as to there is a God. But somehow claims like there is no moon is a valid claim because we have evidence of the moon already. I created a scenario in the previous video in which some people may seem confused over, but let me explain it here, this scenario again. Let's imagine a scenario with two individuals. Person A asks Person B, is the saying there is no God an equally valid claim to there is a God that may require the burden of proof? Person B responds with no, because he believes the default position is non-existence. He continues with, the phrase there is no God is not an equally valid claim because there is no evidence for God. It seems Person B has circular reasoning. Now continue on with the conversation, Person A responds with a different but similar question asking, is there is no moon an equally valid claim to there is a moon that may require the burden of proof? But seemingly Person B responds with a different answer. Yes, because he believes the default position is its existence. He continues with, the phrase, there is no moon is an equally valid claim since there is evidence for the moon. Another example of circular reasoning. Person B has performed two begging the question fallacies and one special pleading fallacy. When Person B stated, there is no God is not an equally valid claim because the default position is non-existence, but then said there is no moon is an equally valid claim because the default position is existence, this was the special pleading fallacy. Then again, one must be consistent with determining if the claim is valid or not. This isn't to say that all atheists think that way, but some individuals do. Some individuals I speak to may point to the use of the Gumball Analogy to explain the concept of a lack of belief. Now, some individuals already recognize some of the issues with the Gumball Analogy, but there are still some that propose that this is still a great analogy. Now, the Gumball Analogy is commonly used by some individuals to explain how atheism is not a belief, but rather a lack of belief. I honestly do like this analogy because I believe it shows some error how some individuals make it in saying that atheism is just the lack of belief. Again, you can define atheism however you want to, but if you're using this analogy, I believe there's some errors here. For those not familiar, there is just a gumball machine with gumballs inside that is either odd or even number. Someone asks you, do you believe there is an odd number of gumballs inside? Well, you aren't given any more information and can't verify. If you say the lack of belief is odd, you're not asserting the belief that is even. Continuing on, do you think the answer is odd? Your yes, I think is odd. No, I think is even. And no, I don't think is odd. In this scenario, person 1 will be an oddist since they believe is odd, or persons 2 and 3 will be considered a oddist since they don't think the answer is odd. Now, it seems a lot of individuals I speak to stop here with the analogy, but there needs to be another question, as this question is just set up in a certain way to make it seem like an oddist versus the rest. Do you think the answer is even? Person 1 will say no, they think is odd. Person 2 will say yes, they think is even. Person 3 will say no, they don't think is even. In this scenario, person 2 will be an evenist since they believe is even, while persons 1 and 3 will be considered a evenist since they don't think the answer is even. You have to ask both questions. So person 1 will be an oddist and an a evenist since they think is odd. Person 2 will be an evenist and a oddist since they think is even. Person 3 will be both a oddist and a evenist since they don't think it's odd or even. Person 3 could be considered both categories, but just replace them with theism and atheism, person 3 would be an atheist and an atheist. That's pointless, that person 3 would just be agnostic or nothing for a matter. Basically, the issue is the question should be, do you believe there is a God and do you believe there is no God? But that's just one way to look at it based on this analogy. One of the most common, the most common type of comment I engage with after my previous videos are those that believe I'm shifting the burden of proof, which seems to come from individuals who didn't get the intended message of my video. And I always wonder, why do I get comments and videos about me trying to debunk the theist on shifting the burden of proof? I talked about the burden of proof for about less than a minute over a total of 2 videos that combined for a total of 10 minutes. But then this comment right here kind of explained it for me. And I will keep this person anonymous, but what he stated was interesting. As far as why people are thinking that this is you trying to shift the burden, That is because other apologists have done this debate on the word atheist in order to do just that, and that past experience informs us that this also might align with that. It's not fair to assume that you are doing it for the same motives as others, but that is a very human thing to do. I have looked at so many repeating comments about the burden of proof over some individuals' presumptions based on their past experiences. That is wild. But honestly, I do find it interesting that some individuals just straight believe that this stereotypical atheist position cannot have a burden of proof, with the theists also requiring the burden of proof. Like, first, to be clear, I honestly do not care about shifting the burden of proof. The burden of proof comes from the Latin phrase meaning the burden of proof lies with the one who speaks, not the one who denies. It applies to anyone making a claim, whether affirmative or negative. Some individuals may look at this and assert that the atheist is the only one that denies the proposition God exists. Well, I mean, that might be true, but what about the proposition that God does not exist? That is a positive claim. Could not atheists deny that proposition? Are they still required the burden of proof? Now, there are other channels and other videos that one can use to define the burden of proof a lot more in details, but in simple, the burden of proof is just the why you believe what you claim to be true. If you want to state that you lack the belief in a God, you have effectively claimed that you lack the belief there is a God. Now, does it require a burden of proof? Yes, but not what you think. The burden of proof is just the why you lack the belief there is a God. It's not that you have to prove to me that if I believe there's a God, that wouldn't even be a proper negation. I mean, a proper negation of that claim would be like a contradiction to believe both things. For example, one cannot lack the belief there is a God and believe there is a God. The second statement will be a negation. Now, I mean, there are like other types of burdens, and this is a simple understanding of it. Just be able to explain if you want to have a conversation for your reasons why. That's your burden of proof. Now, this leads to the definition of belief and belief. Some individuals may look at these words and see them as religious terms. This is far from the truth. Just based off the multiple definitions given of believe in the OED, it can be said that simply to believe is to accept something as true or real and to have confidence or trust in it, whether it's a person, a statement, a principle, or an impression. While belief can be stated as an acceptance that a statement is true or that something exists, just based off these definitions and regions I explained earlier. Theism and atheism are beliefs. Both are an acceptance of the statement whether God exists is true or false, or just no God exists is true or false. Another common statement I hear is that we should assume something doesn't exist until proven, which doesn't make sense. If the question was asking me, do you have a car? I won't say that your car doesn't exist until proven. The objective default position will be to not assume something exists or doesn't exist. Now, some individuals may state that we know the universe works without a God, or we should assume there is no God until proven, which kind of answers the question already that you believe there is no God. These are not an objective default position as it's based on your assumptions already. I mean, we all have assumptions, and I mean, I'll do the same thing. If someone asks me, do I believe that in the 18th dimension? I will say no. I believe there's no in the 18th dimension. Why? Because I believe it's a stupid idea in the first place. It's not that I'm being completely objective. I'm just admitting my assumptions about that thing already affects me. Now, the objective default position will be to remove judgment on whether something exists or doesn't exist. If you assume that thing doesn't exist, you already believe that thing doesn't exist. And this kind of transitions to talking about the null hypothesis with how some people want to address it to me. Honestly, I think how some people who bring that up to me are someone not using it right. I mean, the null hypothesis is basically the starting point for like a scientific investigation. It's basically the idea that there is no relationship or effect between things you are studying that scientists propose. I mean, for example, if I'm testing which type of pill will increase muscle growth, the null hypothesis will be the new pill has no effect on muscle growth. After my experiment, let's say my muscle size increased. I will have evidence to reject the null hypothesis. If my muscles didn't grow, I will stick to the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is basically saying I'll assume that the pill won't work until proven. It's basically a way to make sure that any conclusions I draw are based on evidence and not assumptions. Now, the problem with using the null hypothesis for whether God exists, with no God existing being the null hypothesis, is that both of these claims can be reversed. What if the hypothesis is that no gods exist, with the null hypothesis being God exists? They are both claims. Basically, any one of these claims can be considered as the null hypothesis depending on the proposition. Some individuals might respond to the question, do you believe in the existence of a God, with which God? That is not the question at hand. Which God is irrelevant here, as it may be discussed between religions, but the concept of a God is still the same. The deities, supernaturals, what I explained earlier. It's like asking someone, do you watch football? And they respond with, Which team? That's not the question. Water is best known as the molecule H2O. No, water is not a molecule, it's an atom H. Wait, what? What about H2O? Okay, let me rephrase what he meant. Water could be either known as H2O or just hydrogen. If it's H2O, then it contains hydrogen, but it doesn't work the opposite way. So how about ammonia? That contains hydrogen. That's still water since it contains hydrogen. You can't just prescribe the label of water to it based on a description. Yes, you can. That's how definitions work. So couldn't cyanogen be defined as something that contains nitrogen? If it's CN2, then it contains nitrogen, but not the other way around? I mean, you can, but that'll be unorthodox. So couldn't I prescribe the label of cyanogen to ammonia the same way you have since it contains nitrogen? Wouldn't it just be better to not call ammonia water or cyanogen, but just ammonia? No, as ammonia is still water. You're being stubborn. You can't change words' definitions. If we're playing that game, then like the definition of water was always H2O. I mean, you can look at the history even scholars in the field. Well, definitions change using the old definition. So can I change the definition of cyanogen? No, because that's the definition. Either after all these reasons, I don't expect everyone here to change their perspective on atheism being best understood as the belief there is no God. Heck, I'm even shocked that you made it to the end of the video. I expect most individuals that disagree with me to hit dislike after watching like a minute, or from watching another response from someone else, and then asking questions that I already addressed in the video. I mean, I tried to explain using history of the word, logic, and common objections that I might hear. And again, I'm not telling you have to follow the philosophical standard of definitions. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but don't tell me that I'm wrong when I follow it. I mean, we all got minds. I mean, you can think what you want to think.